I'd like to introduce myself briefly. My name is Asha Nelson. I'm project coordinator at ClimateWest, and I'm honored to be moderating today's webinar, Funding the Future, Enabling Natural Infrastructure Through Federal Programs. So this webinar is a follow-up to IISD's recently published report, which assesses 6 federal infrastructure programs against 14 enabling criteria for natural infrastructure. Today, we bring together experts to discuss why incorporating enabling criteria for natural infrastructure is so important, especially as aging infrastructure, decades of underinvestment, and the growing impacts of climate change strain local governments who are grappling for sustainable infrastructure solutions. Now, this webinar is part of a larger series organized by the Natural Infrastructure for Water Solutions that ClimateWest is pleased to partner on. NIWS is a 5-year initiative led by IISD to help scale up natural infrastructure for cleaner water and more resilient communities across the Canadian Prairie region. NIWS aims for natural infrastructure to be backed by evidence, adopted at local scales, financed and enabled by policy. So you can just click the link in the chat, or you could scan the QR code on the screen if you want to sign up for the monthly newsletter, which includes natural infrastructure related news, reports, and events. Okay, now before we dive in, I think it's important that we start with an acknowledgement of the land that we're on today, and that is so essential to our discussion on natural infrastructure. So ClimateWest work occurs on the traditional lands of many Indigenous nations and covers the territories of Treaties 1 through 8 and 10. Today, I'd like to acknowledge where I live and where the ClimateWest office is based, and that's Treaty 1, the traditional ancestral lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Innuit, Anishinaweg, Dakota, and Dene, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge Treaty 3, specifically the Shoal Lake 40 area, where we get much of our water supply here in Winnipeg, and the Nelson River, Treaty 5, which supplies 70% of our electricity here in Manitoba. At ClimateWest, we deeply respect the treaties and honor Indigenous ways of knowing and being. We are committed to the ongoing work of truth and reconciliation and exploring ways to better respectfully weave these diverse knowledges into our climate adaptation work. So we encourage you all to take time to reflect on the Indigenous lands that you're on and consider ways that you can advance and take actions towards reconciliation. At this point, you might be wondering, who is ClimateWest? Well, we are a nonprofit that provides free, reliable climate services across the prairie regions of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And we're part of a national network of regional climate service providers that help Canadians across the country positively adapt to a changing climate. In terms of what we do, we share climate information and resources. We connect people to resources, people to people, and information to action. And we can help you find climate data, understand its implications, and provide guidance on how to better integrate it into your decision-making. On the screen, you'll see just over on my right, maybe your left, you'll see some knowledge products we've published to help break down climate data and climate change's impact in the region. So I wanted to just quickly share a few upcoming events and opportunities that either we're hosting or they're within our network and we thought that might be relevant to this audience. So ClimateWest is hosting our annual forum on June 17th and 18th, and that's taking place in person in Saskatoon and online. This is a free event where participants explore prairie-specific climate solutions, and it's an opportunity to meet others who are working in this space. There's also the Climate Ready Infrastructure Service, which is a funding program that connects communities who are under 30,000 with a climate expert that can help identify ways for an infrastructure project to be more climate resilient. We also have the Natural Asset Management Roadmap Program, and this is a training program to help local governments, such as I'm sure many of you, recognize, account for, and manage natural assets as part of their community's critical infrastructure. And finally, we have FCM's Local Leadership for Climate Adaptation Initiative, which you're going to hear a lot more about today. But we just wanted to note that they will be accepting applications later in the summer. And finally, we have a help desk that we just wanted to highlight. So you can find that information on the screen. That's our phone number and our email. And feel free to reach out to us if you have a question, big or small, on climate data, understanding climate adaptation in the region, whatever it might be. Okay, now that brings us to today's webinar. We're thrilled to have 3 speakers join us today. This includes Christine Mettler, author of IISD's report, Funding the Future, who will provide an overview of the report's findings. We also have Dustin Carey from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, who's going to talk about the design of the Local Leadership for Climate Adaptation funding stream. And finally, we have Joanna Ikem from the Climate Risk Institute, who will share why natural infrastructure is needed in managing risks and as we face deteriorating infrastructure. Just want to note that we've saved some time at the end for questions. So if you have any questions that come up throughout this webinar, feel free to just add them in the Q&A section that should be at the bottom of your screen. But just note that that's, I believe, on the right of your screen. So don't put your questions in the chat, just put in the Q&A function. Okay, that was a lot of me. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Christine. Christine, would you mind joining us?
Hello, nice to join everyone today. So I'm Christine Mettler, and I am the author of the Funding the Future report that came out in February of this year. So it's a bit of a lengthy report, and I have 15 minutes, so I'll try to make sure that I'm getting to the kind of main takeaways. But essentially, the report was authored in order to explore how federal infrastructure funding can better support local governments to integrate natural infrastructure into their existing systems. So in order to write the report, I reviewed, different grade literature, other relevant reports and academic literature, and interviewed a few content experts. And from that, developed criteria about what could constitute NI-friendly, as we call it in the report, funding. Then kind of look at the thrust of federal infrastructure policy developments, like what the funding landscape has been, how it's evolved over the past few years. And then assessing the major federal funding programs against the criteria that we developed. And then finally, developing recommendations for federal policymakers about how those programs could be, better scoped to support more reliable and sustainable infrastructure systems. So just for some definitions, in terms of what we scoped as major federal infrastructure funding programs. So for the purposes of this report, we are specifically looking at programs that deliver funding to local governments. So either directly via contribution agreements or also indirectly through bilateral agreements with the provinces and territories. And then also looking at programs that are specifically focused on publicly owned infrastructure. So just for the purposes of, trying to keep it focus on the infrastructural component, we didn't look at the kind of broader, climate funding, natural resource funding. It was really focused on the infrastructure component. We looked at programs that either are currently operational or have been within the past 5 years, so since 2019. And then major was scoped as funding programs that provide at least $50 million per year at the federal level. So I'm sure many of the folks that are here are familiar with natural infrastructure, but since there's, a little bit of definitional incongruence in the world of natural infrastructure, NBS, green infrastructure, just to make sure we're on the same page when IISD in the news program is talking about natural infrastructure, they're talking about looking at these 3 different tiers. So, either kind of the new or created natural infrastructure, within cities, in rural areas. So the created or constructed components that use nature or natural processes. restoring or enhancing degraded systems, so ecosystems that are already in place, or conserving the ecosystems that are currently in place, but that might not have necessarily been thought of as infrastructure or providing infrastructure services. So these three components. So that can be like a whole range of, everything from restoring ecosystems to the more constructed components like bioswales in, rights of ways, green roofs, and what have you. So why invest in natural infrastructure? And I can really deliver critical services. NIWS looks at natural infrastructure through a largely through a water management perspective. So, supporting the delivery of clean drinking water, stormwater management, and supporting with wastewater management. It can deliver those services. It can also enhance existing services, and then protect the services that we already have. So, something like wetlands. Woodlands are already offering a lot of important critical public services, and so natural infrastructure protecting it allows those services to continue. Um, and then importantly, natural infrastructure cannot always be a one-for-one replacement with great infrastructure, but in a lot of cases, in most cases, I would say it can, if it can't replace great infrastructure, it can almost always enhance great infrastructure and preserve its longevity. And gray infrastructure can be quite expensive. So preserving those features and its services is pretty important. And then, of course, unlike sole purpose-built infrastructure, natural infrastructure can offer multiple benefits at the same time. So it has the service delivery aspect that I just referred to, but then there's also all of these other benefits: biodiversity, social cohesion, community mental health benefits, green job creation. And there's been, a lot of really compelling studies that have shown that not only is natural infrastructure often a lot more cost effective than gray alternatives for delivering the same services, but also because of all of this extra value that's generated by it, that we're actually, we're spending less in the first place when we're investing in NI, and then we're also getting more value for what we invest in. So there's a lot of reason to invest in natural infrastructure. And then, another thing that really struck me as I was doing this research is how natural infrastructure is one solution that's at the core of all of these interconnected crises that we're currently facing. We have an infrastructure crisis, um, you know, decades of underinvestment in our infrastructure systems. Obviously, we have a housing crisis. It's been, front and center of, a lot of our kind of political discussions as of late. Of course, climate and biodiversity crisis. And so natural infrastructure is something that can actually help to, assuage all of these crises. In terms of the infrastructure crisis, we talked about its cost effectiveness, its ability to enhance gray infrastructure, the housing crisis. Done right, it can help promote density and get more houses in. The climate crisis, promotes resilience, adaptation within communities and biodiversity. Of course, when we're using plants and natural processes, we're helping to make homes for, the creatures at the bottom of our food chain. So, so why does natural infrastructure require a different approach than gray infrastructure? There's a few different reasons. So, first and foremost, local governments just have less experience with natural infrastructure. Um, I don't know that we have similar data for Canada. Maybe my colleagues are familiar, but this is taken from a report a couple years ago done by the Green Infrastructure Leadership Exchange, which is mostly an American organization, although there are a few Canadian members as well. And they polled, people within their network to get a sense of, how long have you been working on? This is specifically looking at green stormwater infrastructure, but I would certainly expect that these findings apply to, the larger picture of natural infrastructure as well. The vast majority, over three-quarters, have been working on it for less than 15 years. So compared to how long we've been doing gray infrastructure, we've just done it a lot less. And we have less experience with how it works and how it can deliver services in different circumstances. So that kind of knowledge sharing, capacity building component is really important when it comes to natural infrastructure. Um, it's more context dependent. So, unlike gray infrastructure that, can maybe more easily be adapted to different circumstances using different kind of, engineering calculations and whatnot. Natural infrastructure, it's a lot more responsive to what's going on at the site, around the site, the local climate conditions, even microclimate can change from, one side of the street to the other. What's going on in surrounding the kind of surrounding uses as well. So it's not as generalizable from one site to another as gray infrastructure. And so for that reason, monitoring and data production is really important to understand, how is NI performing in different circumstances and different contexts, and being able to apply that in different areas so that not everyone has to find it out for themselves, but that we can kind of share that information with each other more effectively. It often requires more cross-sector collaboration. It can all those multiple benefits that I talked about before, that can usually mean that there's a lot more people that want to be involved. It crosses different skill sets and knowledge, disciplinary knowledge sets. So often requires a lot more cross-sector collaboration, which means it will often take more time to plan, coordinate, and align. Natural infrastructure has different life cycle needs than gray infrastructure. So, as I mentioned, usually the investment cost of natural infrastructure, kind of the startup costs are a lot less than gray. But there is usually more maintenance involved, especially in that early kind of establishment period, that 3 to 5 year establishment period. And that's whether we're building new natural infrastructure or we're restoring or enhancing existing natural infrastructure. In order to see those benefits, we do need to put in some maintenance and caretaking, especially in those early years, to make sure that it can actually deliver its full range of benefits. And then we have the issue that, often existing as opposed to new natural infrastructure can actually deliver the best services. So, right now, municipal governments derive a significant portion of their revenue from development. And, that kind of business model actually sometimes incentivizes the destruction of existing natural infrastructure systems. The way that a lot of funding programs are done is that they require the investment in tangible capital assets or new discrete physical objects. And sometimes what we actually need to do is just protect what we already have instead of creating something new. So I won't get into all of these just in the interest of time, but this just shows, this is just a list of the NI friendly criteria for infrastructure funding programs, kind of based on what I was just speaking about how NI is different than gray infrastructure. So there was 14 in total that we developed. These are the first 7, and these are the next 7. So kind of what and why. And then what we did in the report is we looked at, whether Canada's major federal infrastructure funding programs, how much they're actually kind of responding to these criteria, how much they've integrated them. So the 6 that we looked at were the Canada Community Building Fund, formerly the Gas Tax Fund. This is the biggest, $2.6 billion per year. Then the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program, specifically looking at the green infrastructure stream. That is the second largest. It is active until 2028, although it has been largely spent out. The Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, the Local Leadership for Climate Adaptation Fund, which is a new fund, which Dustin will speak about shortly. The National Infrastructure Fund, which was only just a pilot program, active for 2 years, only until 2023. And then the newly announced Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund, which is a larger fund as well, so 600 million. And that was just recently scoped as this report was being written, actually. So the takeaway, this is kind of like looking at them from worst to best. So the green check mark means that the program integrates that many of these NI enabling criteria. Red means that it doesn't integrate them, or it actively kind of does not, it is deterring of them. And then the question mark means we either don't know, or that it depends. Some of these programs can be administered differently based on the bilateral agreements with the provinces. So, it could be there, but it depends how it's integrated into the bilateral agreements that each province is respectively running. So, from least to most, um, the local leadership for climate adaptation fund and the natural infrastructure fund that we just had piloted for 2 years were definitely the most NI friendly. Although, as I mentioned, the NI fund is now discontinued. So the key takeaways of this research was that, the program application processes and criteria, there's a lot of limitation in how they, incentivize the uptake of natural infrastructure. And that's especially, the biggest three that collectively are $4.12 billion of annual funding per year, are not particularly NI friendly. The new housing fund was not pretty good actually, but definitely room for improvement. So lots of missed opportunity there. We need more capacity building to bridge the experience gap. Looking at small, rural, and remote local governments, they have really unique circumstances that require a different approach. And a lot of these are competitive funding programs as well. So the municipalities who don't have experience with natural infrastructure, the more they don't have experience, the less competitive their applications are going to be against those municipalities that do have experience in natural infrastructure. And so that kind of gap can keep getting larger. So there needs to be a different approach, and they need to not be competing against, the Torontos and the Vancouvers. Um, Looking at, funds administered through bilateral agreements may inhibit municipal investment. I have an example, but for the purpose of time, I will put that maybe in questions if people are interested. And, there's uncertainty about the future of federal infrastructure funding programs. So, really quickly, in terms of the recommendations that we made, we need to design natural infrastructure friendly programs using those enabling criteria that I shared earlier. We need to be able to reach rural and underserved communities, develop, targeted measures to support those communities, different streams for different communities, and that are able to help them with lower capacity or less experience. Oh, and another thing is also that, smaller communities have, they have less people, they have less funding base, but it doesn't mean that projects cost any less. Actually, in a lot of cases, projects actually cost more. If they're restoring a floodplain in, where I live in London, Ontario, or, in a small northern community, uh, still costs as much, and yeah, often more, because then you're needing to bring expertise out, you're needing to bring materials out, and it can actually cost more, and they just don't have the funding base. The perennial recommendation of reports about how government can support. We need more funding. We need more funding from the big programs, and we also need dedicated programs as well that are specifically focused on natural infrastructure. We need both. We need to really think about building local capacity, so that, that whole piece about how we just don't have that experience yet. So, we need to support with understanding design standards, or at least processes that have worked well in different contexts and circumstances. Actually start mobilizing that knowledge, and getting people to understand what can work in different circumstances, where and why. And then also looking at opportunities to multi-solve with natural infrastructure. So this basically means, using natural infrastructure to address these interlinked, urgent crises that are happening, at the same time. So looking at how NI can, support the creation of more good quality, dense housing. How, we integrating natural infrastructure into our cities and our rural areas can support, biodiversity, amidst the insect apocalypse, as some people are calling it, that is, really undermining our food systems and our overall, um, you know, uh, well-being as humans on this earth. So really able to integrate natural infrastructure into all of these different, this larger kind of policy picture. Yeah, so I'll leave it there and turn it over to my colleagues. And if folks have specific questions about the report or the recommendations, I will be happy to discuss in the Q&A. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, I really appreciate you providing sort of an overview of natural infrastructure and its many benefits and identifying, of course, the many crises that municipalities are facing right now because we need our solutions to be multi-pronged, and I think natural infrastructure does that. Yeah, I think your presentation was great, and thank you for your research. So I would encourage everyone to please read that report, but hopefully we can dive more into it during our Q&A. So I'm going to pass it over to Dustin now from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Yeah, feel free to share your screen.
Thanks very much, Asha. Pleasure to be here today and joining you from the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people and our nation's capital. Looks like that's coming through. So here to talk to you today about the Local Leadership for Climate Adaptation Initiative that was detailed within that report, and we were really happy to see the results and just how well it performed against other funds in the support for natural infrastructure. So a few details about LLCA overall before I get into the different funding components and how we specifically support natural infrastructure and some of the high quality projects that we've seen out of our first round. The fund overall, awarded under the National Adaptation Strategy, is for $530 million, through which we have to support at least 1,400 initiatives in municipalities across the country by the beginning of 2033. So you might have seen that 2029 date in Christine's presentation. That's our expected last call for the particular funding offers that I'm going to be speaking about today, but some of the different components under LLCA will continue past that date. The Climate Ready Plans and Processes track of funding is really to support system-wide transformations that build resilience to climate impacts over the long term, where adaptation and action, where most of the emphasis will be spent today, are those more on the ground projects that deliver immediate benefits associated with climate risk reduction. And financing adaptation, a funding track that's still under development, hasn't launched yet, is really to test new financing models and diversify adaptation funding responsibilities beyond a really strictly public sector approach where about 95% of all funding right now is coming from. We're really happy to see within the report the emphasis also put on capacity development and building that local capacity. Within GMF, we really see kind of the magic formula, that combination of funding with capacity development. And within LLCA, we've really taken a three-pillar approach of direct funding to municipalities, capacity development delivered by GMF, sometimes paired with that or directly paired with that direct funding, as well as funding for partner organizations to deliver capacity development programming on our behalf. So within our Climate Ready Plans and Processes track of funding and how natural infrastructure can be integrated or supported through it, while not highly included within the report, it is an area that can set the institutional context to help support the development of more green infrastructure projects going forward. We really start from a foundation within this track of the most effective way to mainstream building climate resilience in a community over the long term is to start with an understanding of your climate risks and developing a climate adaptation plan that defines priorities and values over the long term. Previous research that FCM has conducted really shows that communities are most likely to integrate climate resilience across an organization into multiple orders of business and service and multiple projects when they have that unifying document that shows long-term priorities. So really saw this as an important avenue to support communities across the country. And we hope to roughly triple the number of communities in Canada with either a risk assessment or an adaptation plan or both by the end of the program. From that baseline, we can also support projects that work on that integration of adaptation priorities into other municipal systems, like climate responsive natural asset management within an asset management system, or, for instance, new infrastructure design processes that a municipality relies on when determining which types of infrastructure are best suited to meet particular objectives. But as noted, most of the content of this presentation will focus on our adaptation and action funding track. And this is one where, again, we're looking at those on-the-ground projects that by the end of it, a municipality is receiving a tangible benefit in climate risk reduction. And we're supporting this pipeline through both feasibility studies and our implementation projects. You saw Christine speak about the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. Adaptation in Action was pitched to the federal government as a complementary program to DMAF. So where the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund has a minimum project cost of $1 million, which tended to be much more difficult to access for smaller communities and to support smaller projects, particularly where a lot negotiations and those negotiations and cost sharing with the province might slow things down as well. Adaptation in Action is those direct fund or provides direct funding to municipalities for those smaller types of projects. Within our feasibility study offer, it's really a pipeline to be able to support more implementation projects. So all of our key criteria and eligibility requirements for implementation projects apply for the scopes of projects that we support studies for. So total eligible costs have to be expected to be under $1 million. Elements like that. But in addition, because we're providing the funding that could be self-provided for these types of projects, we expect communities to go above and beyond to an element. I liked how Christine put it, where most great infrastructure projects can almost always be enhanced by the inclusion of natural infrastructure. And really building on that ethos, one of the requirements we set in is feasibility studies that we fund must include an assessment of whether the project objective can be realistically met or augmented by the inclusion of natural infrastructure. The final study doesn't need to include that in the ultimate project that they recommend, but at the very least, it must be included in the assessment. Likewise, we require the study conduct an equity assessment to determine which equity deserving groups may benefit from and or be burdened by the project. ultimately to support those implementation projects that have a higher degree of equity focus. For our implementation projects, as noted, these are projects with total eligible costs of up to $1 million, and as noted, is a complementary fund to DMAF. Really unique within the funding landscape, I believe, and a first within GMF, is the cost share that GMF will provide to support these projects is quite variable. Any project coming to us can assume that we will fund at least 60% of the unfunded portion of a project. So if a project is costs 800 million or 800,000, for instance, an applicant can assume that we will fund at least 60% of that, but it can go up to 100% based on strategic factors that we want to support, including 10% more for small communities, 10% more for partnerships between communities, so either in-kind or cash contribution from other municipalities or Indigenous communities, 10% for meaningfully addressing anti-racism, equity, and inclusion, and of course 10% for what we have dubbed nature positive adaptation as an inclusion within the project. One of the elements that we require for these projects is that a community must have completed either a climate risk assessment or an adaptation plan to access funding, and that the project be aligned with either a priority risk or an action from the adaptation plan. As well, we measure the outcomes of the project as it provides resilience benefits for climate resilient infrastructure and community spaces, nature-based solutions, and community well-being. So specific to the inclusion of natural infrastructure within implementation projects, one of the elements we introduced is that in the competitive process, the inclusion of natural infrastructure is one of the elements, the evaluation criteria that all projects are assessed against. So really from the beginning, projects that include natural infrastructure do have a competitive edge up in the funding landscape on which ones will ultimately be successful in receiving funding. In addition, we take the preservation of natural spaces quite seriously, and environmental disturbances incommensurate with the risk reduction that the project, with the benefits that the project provides in risk reduction, are grounds to decline the project. On the opposite end, projects that really excel in the use of natural infrastructure to manage climate risks, or really strong benefits in protecting natural areas during or against the impacts of climate change, provide top marks and that competitive edge. So as noted, we're willing to put more money on the table for projects that incorporate natural infrastructure, and we do this through our independent peer review process. So on the grading scale that our peer reviewers use, any project that receives a 75% or higher in the nature-based adaptation evaluation criteria will receive that extra 10% cost share incentive from the Green Municipal Fund. Giving a bit of an overview of one of my favorite projects that we saw under our first call for applications and funding profile comes out of Annapolis Royal in Nova Scotia. So small community, only about 500 residents, and one of the oldest communities within Canada. It's about 400 years old, so you can imagine how much disturbance that shoreline has seen over that amount of time. And as a result of things like decreased sea ice in the winter and more severe storms, they're noticing accelerations in coastal erosion. And the project they propose to mitigate those that erosion activity is the restoration and planting of native salt marshes. Has pretty significant biodiversity benefits, and the opportunities to be paired with some hardscaping later down the line. But yeah, saw this as a really excellent project to showcase. In addition, we saw projects such as shoreline restoration in North Vancouver, wetland restoration in Hamilton, low impact development projects for stormwater management in Ottawa, and stormwater management ponds in places like Bonaccord.
1 minute.
Okay. Also see, as mentioned, we also had the partner-led development aspect to it, where nonprofit organizations are delivering adaptation programming on our behalf over 2-year periods. The first call saw natural infrastructure and natural asset management as one of the focus areas that we've really wanted to focus on. So as one example, Green Communities Canada was funded to about $300,000 to help communities create living cities policy pathways and to provide training around that. I'll end with the next call for applications will be opening shortly, summer of this year. And we plan on moving towards predictable semi-annual calls for applications until that planned last one in 2029 to stay on top of the timing of the calls. Recommend everyone subscribe to FCM's newsletter, FCM Connect. Thanks again for the invitation.
Awesome. Thanks, Dustin. Yeah, thanks so much for walking us through the LLCA funding and just like, I think that you've put a lot of like thought into the design to make sure, you know, equity deserving groups, for example, are benefiting from this funding. But as we're here to discuss today, specifically on how we can increase the presence of natural infrastructure across the country, not only with big municipalities, but obviously a big priority is our rural and small municipalities. So I think that's very evident in the design of this program. So that's very exciting. I also think it's great that you've like created financial incentives and other ways to ensure that small communities who maybe lack, I guess, experience with natural infrastructure are getting some of that experience. And I think that can help us continue to prioritize that in our municipalities. So thank you for that. Okay, last but not least, we have Joanna. Do you mind joining us? Are you here?
I am here.
Perfect. Okay. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to you. Thank
Okay,
you.
good. Let's get around to sharing my screen here and then make it a little bigger. Okay, so yeah, I'm here to talk about working with nature as normal. I think the previous speakers kind of did a great job of talking about what natural infrastructure is. And I think, you know, probably a lot of people on the call are already converted to thinking that this is a good idea, but we need to make it normal in Canada to really consider natural infrastructure in every infrastructure project. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. And hopefully I'm going to provide you with some optimistic thoughts and knowledge that this is progressing in Canada and we're trying to go faster and we need everybody on the call to do their part. So I have a few asks as well. I like to share a little bit about myself, just so that you know that I'm coming to this with a fair bit of passion. I've been working on nature-based solutions for like 25 years, 10 years in the UK, 10 years in Canada in consultancy, and then recently moved to kind of more guidance development and capacity building. This is me as a graduate student. Well, just my first job, basically walking rivers in the UK. You can see how happy I am to be out with my Write in the Rain notepad, because it's obviously grey and rainy in the UK. And I still have that same passion for being out in nature and basically helping to integrate that into our daily lives. So that's me. I'm a geomorphologist by training, which my mother always said, a geomorphologist. So yeah, I was like, well, I do rivers and coasts. So yeah, so that's a little bit about me for those of people who don't know me on the call. So I want to talk about why nature is good for the economy. There's been a lot of focus, for example, coming up to the federal election on economic resilience with the, talking about tariffs and trade with what's happening in the US. So, but the bottom line is really that, oh, sorry. I'm on my laptop and I press something. So when nature is degraded, basically our economy and our well-being suffers. So this graph here shows catastrophic insurable losses, which is put together by IBC and Cat IQ, and this version courtesy of my previous employers at the Intech Center. But basically, we had a record year of 8.9. I think this graphic isn't actually all up to date. $8.9 billion last year. And you can see this curving upwards. And obviously that's only what is actually insured. And there's about 3 to 4 times that's not insured. So the actual total bill is a fair financial burden. And obviously that financial burden doesn't reflect any of the physical health or mental health impacts. And obviously climate change is underlining this curve, but also the loss of natural infrastructure that is basically degrading our resilience to climate impacts and shocks and kind of ongoing change. So I think, we need nature to be resilient, and we need nature to be economically resilient. The other concept I really like, and if you haven't read this yet, the Dasgupta review, so there's various different versions. There's a 10-page version, like a 70-page version, and a 300-page version, I think. But the solution starts with accepting that economy is embedded within nature and not external to it. And similarly, people are a part of nature, not apart from nature. And I think, that is really central to like how we consider nature as kind of a serious issue. We were always talking about the economy as somehow something different than nature, but really our infrastructure, our built infrastructure is within a superstructure of nature that somehow we have divorced our thinking from. So we do all this work to protect like our built infrastructure and manage it, but then we don't do the same for our natural infrastructure. And we are all asset managers through the decisions that we made and our investment decisions. So in terms of, my own personal belief and what is driving me forward in this work is the thought that restoring balance within our natural systems and working with rather than controlling natural processes is really central to our future well-being. And I think, the approach of nature-based solutions and natural infrastructure is about finding how nature is working, and because it's normally a balanced system, how it was working before we intervene potentially, and trying to kind of restore some of that balance, whether that's water or sediment or ecology that may be out of balance. I'm just going to touch on a little bit about defining nature-based solutions as well, because I think, natural infrastructure, as we're talking about it here, is part of that. But I just wanted to make sure everybody has a wider view of kind of nature-based solutions being actions to protect, sustainably manage, or restore natural or modified ecosystems that really address our social challenges, whilst also providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. And that natural infrastructure is a subset of that. So anything like including pollinators and you kind of natural assets that may not be providing necessarily kind of very infrastructural outcomes are also part of nature-based solutions. So we need to make sure that we're not thinking too narrow as well. And then the other thing I really want to get across is about thinking about different scales. So often in Canada, these arrows kind of really show that communities are at the center of our kind of planning of adaptation and managing our water resources, etc. And in Canada, we've been fairly good at kind of trying to develop tools and guidance for communities, buildings, or individual scales, but it's really patchy, and we're really still working on it to make things at the river basin scale, or whether that's at the kind of strategic coastal cell scale or the landscape scale, which are the scales that natural systems work with. So, you know, it's not, we're not going to get very far solving river flooding, for example, if we're not looking upstream of how we can soak up that water, particularly when we've already altered the watershed to maybe drain the catchment as quickly as possible. So, you know, some of these scales are also part of the solution, is basically trying to work at the natural system scale. Some good news. So I'm going to present some kind of initiatives that are already ongoing, and I think Brittany will be placing in the chat as I'm speaking all the links to these things. So firstly, the National Natural Capital Accounts are being prepared by StatsCan. So you can find the Census of Environment online. We're one of 41 countries globally that's compiling natural capital accounts using the UN system of environmental economic accounting, ecosystem accounting. It's too many E's and too many A's, or CEA as we call it. So you can find the Census of Environment, and the data is kind of being posted as it's produced. So I really recommend people look at that. There's also indicators that are being, which are time-based and being followed. For example, greenness of population centers is one that has been followed for a few years now. So we can see that it's gone up slightly this last year, which is good news. So all that work on tree canopy may be paying off. So this is a good source of information, and actually the resolution of the data can actually be used at the municipal level as well, because I know that the people in Montreal are using this data. So that's a good source of information. Just a little overview of how the UN system works, and so that you have a bit of an idea of how natural capital accounting works. So basically there's the physical accounts, so the light green boxes on this diagram. We look at extent and condition, and that's the stock account of what kind of ecosystems we have, or what natural assets we have. And then the flow accounts are really what services that they provide. So ecosystem services, you know, like water filtration, for example, it's a service that we get from nature. So that service is part of the physical account. But then the monetary value, so these darker green boxes, so that the valuation, there was a question about how things are valued in the UN account system. That's the service that is valued. And then those services are stacked together to get an indication of the value of the ecosystem asset. So that's how that works. So the good news is that is also, so we're doing work at the national level, but at the local government level, this is already ongoing in Canada. We have over, I think it's 160 plus local governments already doing some work on managing or inventorying and valuing their natural assets. And even some of these local governments are starting to put that in their financial reports. And that was the subject of this recent report, which you can see the QR code, and I think Brittany's putting the report link. So basically, we're already seeing people putting natural assets, natural infrastructure in financial reporting. So you can see the activity across the country is not equal. We have big blobs in British Columbia and Ontario. In British Columbia, that's where the Natural Assets Initiative really started. So there's been quite a lot of kind of word of mouth of neighboring communities kind of, adopting that kind of practice. In Ontario, asset management is regulated, and now people actually need to include green infrastructure, which includes natural infrastructure, in their asset management plans. So, and also the work of the conservation authorities in Ontario has been helping to push that forward. So there's another big community of practice there. What's in the new guide? Just a brief view on that. So what we've tried to do in this most recent guide is show how people can move from financial reporting, from just kind of descriptive disclosures, stepwise approach to making more complete disclosures. So the first thing, kind of, just saying what natural assets you actually have, and what services you depend on in your community, and then passing through extent, condition, ecosystem services. You can see it reflects the UN system, and then the valuation of those ecosystem services. And at the end, we've added replacement costs, because that is what asset managers want to know. And it's, so that asset management and financial reports align. That's also useful information. I think the most interesting thing here is, though, we also identified the need to think about disclosing change. A lot of people are working on the baseline, but actually, when we start showing change, that's actually where it gets interesting. If we're showing that our natural assets are declining, or we're losing them, or they're going up because we're doing lots of good work, then that's, because the aim is better management and kind of, expanding our network of natural infrastructure. And just to say that it's because there's no standards around this is voluntary. People can actually start with different types of natural asset first, or different services first, and then build up their disclosures or their knowledge in these areas over time. So it's not like you have to do everything at once. Just a little word to say, we're hearing about interest in natural infrastructure for wider partners. I think on this call, we maybe have a certain community, but we're hearing from there are different communities that are interested in natural infrastructure and natural capital and natural assets, using slightly different language sometimes. But for example, here, there's a intelligence memo. There's actually a couple of intelligence memos now from the C.D. Howe Institute. So, kind of interested in public policy and fiscal responsibility. The Canadian Institute of Actuaries, so the people who price put financial prices on risk, they are interested in nature and biodiversity. And then the accountancy side, we've got the Tangible Natural Resources draft standard at the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board. Sorry, the acronyms are always busy. So the consultation period has closed, but actually I think it was 46 responses, 10 or 11 were from Canada. So Canada is actually playing a large role of influencing this standard and being vocal in helping develop it. So because it says we are actually based in Toronto as well, so that's helpful. So yeah, watch out for, they're considering the comments at the moment, but that will be coming out soon, hopefully.
1 minute.
Yeah, great, thanks. So I just have a last couple of slides. So people who were reading the platforms before the election will know that in the Liberal platform, there was a commitment to prioritize natural infrastructure like forested areas and wetlands, basically through mix of conservation funding, climate adaptation funding, and public-private sector investment. So we will be looking for the mandate letters are in development and coming out soon. And we have a new infrastructure minister to talk to about that. And then so in my own work, I've been trying to mainstream through, this is a recent article from Policy Options, the Canadian Infrastructure Council. We're talking about natural infrastructure. And then this figure with the embeddedness that looks a little bit like the Descriptor review diagram is actually from the advice to the Quebec government from the experts on adaptation. So trying to mainstream this in all my work. And I think the three key thoughts I wanted to leave you with before our discussion was that communities are on the front lines of managing climate and nature risks, and the local action is key to actually managing our infrastructure better. We can work with natural infrastructure to deliver services, address climate change in two ways, and maximize benefits to communities. And mainstreaming can help us make better informed economic decisions, both for development and adaptation, demonstrate accountability for natural assets, and restore some of that balance that we may have lost. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Joanna. Thanks for your presentation. I thought it was really interesting to see the ways in which our country is like increasingly prioritizing natural asset management. It was also quite striking to see that, yeah, we have still a long way to go here in the prairies, but as an organization that's supporting adaptation in the prairies, it's helpful to see that and to think about ways that we can better support more natural infrastructure. So we only have less than 15 minutes. So I'm going to ask our presenters to join me back on the screen. Christine, are you there? Perfect. Okay, so we have a few questions in the Q&A that I'd like to ask everybody. I'm going to start with, let me just pull them up. Okay, so this is a question from Amelia. Any of you can answer, but maybe Dustin, I'll start with you. Are there any examples of Indigenous communities who have completed natural infrastructure projects? And does funding have carve-outs specifically for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities? Most of our references have been about municipalities.
Yeah, I recall at the news forum last year in Calgary, Natural Infrastructure on the Prairies, there were a number of really good examples of First Nation-led projects. So I can't recall the name of the particular nation, but it was really around the use of like reintroducing beaver and supporting beaver dam development for water conservation within the watershed, for instance. One community in interior BC called Kanakabar has done really fantastic work on wildfire and heat preparedness using both gray and natural infrastructure systems. So there are a lot of really pioneering and nation-leading work being led by Indigenous communities within Canada. Excuse me. On that carve-out dimension, it really depends on which funding source is coming from. Frequently in programs like the 2 Million Trees initiative, there are specific Indigenous funding associated with that. Within LLCA, because our legal funding target is municipalities, what we have really prioritized is collaboration between municipalities and First Nations. So we've seen some in, for instance, the Yukon and North Vancouver that have seen good participation and cooperation between a municipality and a neighboring First Nation community. So yeah, there are avenues in our program while they're not the primary target.
Awesome, thank you. Maybe I'll pose another question because we don't have too much time together. This is from Layla. Given that most of this activity is happening at the local level, what roles could the federal government play to support these efforts specific to freshwater? Maybe Christine, but obviously any of you can speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, like the whole report it's basically like for federal policymakers. Am I frozen? I look frozen. Let's try this. Okay. Here we go. Yeah, so I mean, like funding is a huge lever, right? It's a carrot. You know, obviously, like there could be more done in terms of you know, regulation. Like in the United States, for example, I would say the United States, most municipalities in the United States are a lot more advanced than the average Canadian municipality because there's different policy levers, specifically around like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, have certain policy levers that that, punish municipalities for outletting, dirty water during storm events. So that's really forced a lot to look into green infrastructure. But yeah, I think the funding aspect is a huge way in which and just kind of making sure that those programs are being scoped in ways that are actually enabling the uptake of green infrastructure. It's like so much of the money is for like we need all kinds of infrastructure, but like so much of the money is for the hard engineered infrastructure. That's what we have the experience in. And so like really just kind of revamping those programs in a way to, not to stop municipalities from applying for hard gray infrastructure when it's needed, but really prompt them to, a lot of times gray solutions are taken because that's what we know and that's what we're used to and that's what the funding seems. But and a lot of times a natural alternative will be just as good, if not better, or at least enhance the gray. So if there's opportunities within those programs to really prompt or even require applicants to consider natural infrastructure to deliver the services that they're looking to deliver.
I would just add for that, that's something we definitely talked about when we were developing actions under the National Adaptation Strategy, was basically starting at green and then having to justify moving towards gray, because there are situations where green is not going to work, or you need a hybrid solution. So I think having a mandatory start at green and then justify gray kind of approach would be preferable, and that's something that we've been suggesting for a few years now.
Awesome. Thank you too. It looks like a lot of our questions are being answered just in the chat, so I might just pose a question myself if that's okay, and I would encourage our other panelists to do the same. I guess this is a question for Dustin. So my understanding is that the LLCA has recently launched, and I'm just curious, what has the Green Municipal Fund sort of learned about this early or pre-development stage, and what is needed to make effective change in major funding programs to enable climate considerations in natural infrastructure?
Yeah, one of the big lessons coming out of this was to figure out what the outcomes we wanted to see from this programming was during the early design process. At the point where we signed the funding agreement with the federal government, we knew how much money we were working with, the number of municipalities we had to support, and broad shape of what the programs would look like. And all of the rest of that still had to be filled in. So it was really intentional on our part, going through a process where we agreed that we wanted equity to be a central aspect of this program, to deliver disproportionate benefits to the people disproportionately vulnerable to climate impacts. We wanted natural infrastructure to be a preferred solution wherever feasible. And it was a conscious decision on our part to put more money on the table, potentially funding fewer programs to be able to achieve those ends. Likewise, we've heard from communities for a long time that traditional cost benefit analyses for climate adaptation projects are hard to do. So to make sure we are justified in saying that we're supporting high value, potentially transformative, impactful projects, we can point to that alignment with a risk assessment or an adaptation plan to show that prioritization rather than relying on tools that don't necessarily fit the bill very well.
Cool, thank you. Do any of our panelists have either comments or questions for each other, just with the last maybe 3 minutes that we have here?
I'll put one to Christine. So going through this process where we saw the different program structures like DMAF to the Natural Infrastructure Fund, did you come away with a conclusion that one type that is either explicitly focused on natural infrastructure or a wider range program that includes natural infrastructure is better positioned to really push for this, the types of projects that we're hoping to see.
Yeah, for sure. Good question. So I think that the takeaway is that we need both. We need to have natural infrastructure integrated into the big infrastructure funding programs, the ones that are multi-billion dollars, and have that option. But then I also think that something like the Natural Infrastructure Fund, that really got municipalities to specifically think about NI, like it was only for NI. So I think that a lot of municipalities might not even consider NI, but then having an opportunity to do it through a targeted program like that might kind of give them the experience and get thinking about it. And then so yeah, I think we just need funding across the board. I think we need targeted, and it needs to be integrated into the broader picture as well.
Awesome. Any other comments or questions? This will probably be the last one, unfortunately.
I have one for Joanna. Um, so I guess you shared a little bit about how nature-based solutions has gotten some mention in the new federal government's platform. Obviously, a lot remains to be seen in how that's going to be scoped and what's going to happen. The infrastructure, like ISIP, the Invest in Canada Infrastructure Funding Program is basically over. That's been spent out. And so remains to be seen if there's going to be, a new kind of flagship infrastructure funding program. So I was just wondering if you're super involved in a lot of different kind of organizations, and I wonder if you have any sense of what we might be able to expect in terms of, support for natural infrastructure, nature-based solutions, from this government.
Yeah, I know. So from my conversations, I know several people in federal government departments are really on board with mainstreaming. And I think mainstreaming for me means, every infrastructure project should have natural infrastructure, whether that's a road or a school or, some kind of, traditional infrastructure project. Every project should have a natural infrastructure component where possible. And I think that is where the thinking is going, so that we have projects that are mainly natural infrastructure, but we also have natural infrastructure in, the widening of a road. How is the drainage being dealt with? Do we have some natural infrastructure solutions for managing the water runoff, etc., and kind of filtering and improving water quality and things like that? So I think really this mainstreaming, because we can't have it as an aside thing. It needs to be a kind of a central thing. And I think that's why I've been pushing so much as well on the financial side, the accounting side, is that when it's actually, when you invested in a natural infrastructure solution, are we fully recognizing all the services that that's providing? Not at the moment. We might be in some places where it's more constructed natural infrastructure, but natural assets that are natural are not being fully recognized. So I think when it also starts hitting people's bottom lines, then that's where people kind of take notice, when we obviously want to show something for our investment as well.
Awesome. That's a great way to conclude. I just want to thank the presenters for joining me here today and for all your work in amplifying natural infrastructure and working towards increased implementation. I also want to thank IISD for bringing all our panelists together. I'll just note that it looks like the chat has been sort of lighting up throughout today's webinar, so we are going to be gathering all of those links. I know Joanna definitely shared a lot of links, which is wonderful. So we'll be sharing that along with the recording. I think we'll aim for next week is the goal. But yeah, I think that's it. So thank you everyone again for joining us. We hope to see you at our next webinar series, maybe in the fall, but no promises.